Oki, Naganago, Mekoche Chestakomaki, Dekots Nagotine Siku. Hi, my name is Michelle, and I use she and her pronouns, and today is January 8th. I want to start by acknowledging that we're on Treaty 7 territory. The Blackfoot Confederacy has maintained these lands for since time immemorial, and the Confederacy is made of the Siksika, Kainai, and Bagani, and south of the border, the Blackfeet Nation. Why does that matter today, out of all days? Is that we're all celebrating Lily Gladstone's win on the first globe, and she's from the Blackfeet Nation. So it's interesting hearing American terminology talking about our area. Anyway, Treaty 7 was signed in 1877 with the Blackfoot, Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda. I acknowledge all First Nation, Métis, Inuit status, and non-status across Turtle Island as the keepers of these lands. And I welcome you all to our first 2024 book club. And of course, we're doing lessons in legitimacy. And lucky enough to have author Sean here. And should I call you Dr. Carleton? Would you prefer that?
No, please just call me Sean.
Okay, that sounds great. Well, welcome to our book club. These are our like regulars that come quite frequently. We're missing a couple. One of our favorites named Rosemary. She's a little older. She had surgery done on her eyes and all sorts of stuff, and other surgeries as well. So we're just keeping her in our thoughts and our prayers because she has been doing anti-racism work in Calgary for decades. So like this is right up her alley. So she's been great. And her husband actually is a prof, and his specialty was South African apartheid. So it was really interesting, when he would come to talk about these things that we are talking about all the time. So, so welcome to our book club. Typically, we allow Indigenous people to speak first, and that would be me and Kathy Bear. We're the only ones that identify as Indigenous, but obviously because settlers have always taken the space, so the book club was to try to give space to Indigenous first and then and learn from there. So in an attempt to create that safer space, as you know, you can't have a totally safe space, but we can at least try and work at not being ableist as well. So Shelley Nearing, she's on the call here, and she really has helped us with not being ableist as well. So really grateful for her knowledge and what she's contributed to the Reconciliation Action Group as well as this book club. So yeah, that's a little bit about us, and welcome, Sean.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for the invitation, Michelle. It's good to be back, even if virtually in Treaty 7. For those of you I haven't met, I was living in Calgary from 2016 to 2020, just in the pandemic. And then I've since moved to the University of Manitoba, where I'm a professor in the departments of history and Indigenous studies out here in Treaty 1 territory. But I still think of my time in Calgary very fondly, all of the people that I got to meet and connect and still get the opportunity to engage with. And what a cool opportunity, I think, for you folks to have a book club, right? Part of the work that I do is thinking about education and why, education is the answer. And that doesn't happen just in the university. That's part of, I think, the argument is that education needs to be thought of more broadly. And book clubs are an awesome opportunity to engage with academic nerds like me, but also other kinds of books. And I saw Michelle's list for this year, and it looks phenomenal. So I'm sure you'll have lots of great conversations, and I'm just really glad to be kicking off the new year, and happy to. I guess I'm a member of the book club, but you can kind of chat about certain things, but I'm happy to answer any questions and generally just kind of hang out.
That's awesome. I know what I was talking to my friend. So I'm just going to do a little brag here. For whatever reason, Kathy and Kat worked together to make me the stained glass um, grow grew, and it's gorgeous. It's ridiculously beautiful. I can't believe how gorgeous it is. So Kathy Bear, she's really talented at being able to do things like this, and Kat helped with part of the drawings and such of it. So Really, thank you. I wanted to brag about it here more than anything. And Kat actually runs a settler book club too. So I try to create that safer space for Indigenous people, but there it's safe for settlers to be settlers, right? And to talk and try to help each other in that way. Um, so yeah, so we actually have two book clubs. There's this one and then the Settlers Book Club. And that I think is so great. I wish I could commit to two books a month, but I can't. I just can't do that. So otherwise I would. Yeah, so I really want to thank you. A little story for the rest of the book club. I actually had seen Sean had posted something on one of the socials about, hey, we're running a contest, blah, 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 blah. Tag your friends or something. And I did whatever he asked. And then so he sent me one of these books and it says, Michelle, thanks for all your support for truth and justice. And Sean, just because of what has been happening with Palestine and, the nationalism and like this being the blueprint of nationalism through the education system, like there were times I was like, oh my God, this is the blueprint. This is the blueprint. And I kept saying that on Twitter, but, it's like screaming in the void sometimes. So, um, so I want to ask you some questions here in a bit, and some of them will be something like, what are things that you learned that you didn't know before writing this book, blah, 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 blah. But I wanted to tell you, I just about like, I couldn't believe, I shot right out of my chair when I learned about how the school trustees and how the voting for women was first put together thanks to the books or thanks to the education system possibly going through. Um, I was really offended by most of the, concepts of classism of that time, and you really wrote it really well about, if you were part of the HBC, how you were like, an upper class and how all these kids were integrated solely based off of basically work. And so I was really offended by a lot of it because I kept thinking as a Boilermaker's daughter, where I would be in this class system, right? And going from there, as opposed to the aristocrats, and then seeing basically the start of women's voting through this book, I was pretty shocked. And BC was very different in the sense that there was so much integration from the beginning. So those were some really like pretty big takeaways for me. Going to Comox, I never would have thought Vancouver Island was where they really did most of the foundation of setting up of Canada there. Like I was really shocked by it. So great book. I really enjoyed reading it. I didn't get to the very last couple of pages here because I'm I'm in my dining room. I have a brand new table and I had to move it today out of all days. So unfortunately, the time allotted to finish the book, I was unable to do it thanks to that, but that's okay. So I just wanted to give my initial thoughts of reading it to you. I'll pass it over to Kathy, and then we'll go to the other settlers in alphabetical order. So Carol, Kat, Marla, Shelley, and Wendy.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Sean. It's nice to see you. Um, I really enjoyed your book. I finished it a couple of days ago, but I really couldn't come up with too many questions. I dog-eared it everywhere, and it's all just examples that you give that are kind of like shocking or whatever, like, triggering for me. Um, so, I really don't have a lot of comments to say about anything specific in here, but I do want to say that it really has opened up my thinking about the school system because, yeah, I've always just thought of the Indian residential school, and I never really thought about other, like the mainstream schooling. Um, like I didn't realize that Indigenous people went to school in BC with the regular kids because I think Alberta was a little bit more strict in that way. Um, I remember one little anecdote is when I was little, I remember my dad being on the phone and being surprised when my sister could join the regular school system in Edmonton, Alberta. I remember the shock in his voice going, she can go there kind of thing. And because my dad was a German and my mother was Cree. So he got custody thanks to the government. And I just remember that'll always stick with me, the surprise, because I never understood it as a kid. It's only now that I'm reaching close to 60 that I really understand why he made that comment, because he totally didn't expect her to be, because that would have been about 61 or something that she was starting school. So not 61, about 67. 68. So like for her to be going to a regular school was unheard of. Well, unusual, I guess. But there are other people that have made it into the regular school system, but they were more Métis. My sister was only my half sister, and she was pure Indigenous. Like there's no way she could pass as anything but Indigenous. So yeah, I just really enjoyed reading the book. There's yeah, it just kind of opened my mind to how education was used. So yeah, thank you so much for writing this book, Sean.
You know what? I'm gonna take space again. Sorry, Carol, to do that to you. You've When I was reading this, Sean, on page 53, I had to Google squattocracy. I was so offended. And when I read it, I'm like, I can't even post this online because I know these right-wing nut jobs will actually start using this again. I'd rather them read your book and have to find it rather than me putting it out on the internet. And the other thing I wanted to say was when Justin Trudeau apologized about the hanging of these chiefs, I was like, how did I not know that? And so I was when I was reading your book, I was really happy to see that in here so that there was like context to that, because like for me, it was embarrassing. I'm like a part of the Liberal Party of Canada. I'm part of the Indigenous Peoples Commission, and I had no concept, no idea. So I was really grateful for all this background on it. So thank you for that. And now I promise I'll send it back to Carol.
Thanks, Michelle. So Sean, I'm on Treaty 7, and I'm here to learn and disseminate what I learn. And your book was, I have to say, there's a bit of a story. I couldn't find the book, and I had to drive to Canmore on Friday to get it in this little, like I tracked it down in a little bookstore in Canmore. So you seem to be sold out in Calgary. And anyway, I got it. I've still got a few pages left to read, but there was so much in this book. I mean, you really pulled so many things together for me, and you really increased my awareness of the schools in residential schools, the types of schools, where they started, the type of people that were, the brutality involved in it all. And you really made me reflect on my own schooling as well, and how my own schooling legitimized a lot of this. And there were so many things. I mean, I wrote notes, and tons of them. And one of the things that I really appreciated was the dialectics of how colonial dispossession fed capitalist accumulation. That's a quote from your book. These are things that I didn't know and I didn't think about. And so much to this that, I have so many notes in front of me. How they prep the kids to, accept this, and how the parents struggled to kind of reclaim their kids. And that quote by Sir John A. Macdonald, I did not know that quote. And when I read it, I thought, okay, this is the worst thing I've ever heard. One of them anyway.
Carol, can I ask you, would you consider joining the Reconciliation Action Group? Because we're trying to get John A. Macdonald High School renamed. And a lot of people are unaware, like my own dad, I think I accidentally hurt his feelings a couple of times talking about Winston Churchill and John A. Macdonald and why I don't want these schools named after them because they're racist. So I just want to pot that in your ear. You don't have to answer right now. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Sure. like the thing about it is that it really spoke to that's how entrenched that white privilege was, and the patriarchal type of you know, hegemony over everything. And I loved that you keep quoting Gina's Star Blanket, because I love her stuff. I love her stuff on politics and structure and things like that. So and how gender binary, you made that comment, you quoted, and was introduced in the colonial schools. And I thought, yes. And how Indigenous girls were trained to be domestics, or like the white Victorian women. And I mean, I thought how the cultural genocide, I mean, it just clearly your book blew my mind. So I was glad I took a little trip to Canmore and got it. It was worth it. And I just love, like, I look at the back, your appendix, like you have done so much work on this, and I really appreciate how you pulled it together for me. So there's much more I could say, but I won't. I'll let someone else speak. So thank you.
Hi, Sean. I'm Kat. I go by she, her, or they, them. Yes, I run Settlers Book Club. I was born on Treaty 1 territory, so it's nice that you are there now. I also really appreciated this book. I was a little nervous after hearing that you were a professor. I thought it was going to be all, academic and stuff, but you wrote it so well, so clearly. You laid everything out so beautifully. And a lot of the things that Carol said also I found as well. Particularly, I mean, I think I might have realized this before, but it really brought it home that how education is used to train us to be capitalist settlers, and how education is used to colonize, and it is still ongoing, this process, that we can't forget that it wasn't just history, that is still happening right now. I would definitely recommend this book to anybody and everybody. And I did have a question for you. Are we taking questions now, or? Yeah, okay. You did an amazing amount of research, and I was just wondering what surprised you the most in all your research. Because obviously a lot of these things surprised us, the things that we didn't know, but what surprised you?
Okay, great. Michelle, I don't know how this works. Do you want me to answer now? Do you want me to wait and
what are you
respond to
comfortable
everybody?
with? Yeah, what, maybe we can just add that to the collection if you'd like, and we can keep
Sure.
going from there if that's easiest. And then
Sure, yeah. I'm taking notes, so I'll come back to all of these great points, including your trip out to Canmore.
Awesome.
So thanks so much, Kat.
Yeah. Anything else you want to add, Kat?
Nope.
Awesome.
Is it my turn now? Okay. Yeah, great book, Sean. Thank you very much. I think well, all the notes and the appendices and everything just sort of says it all before you even dig into the book. I'm that person that reads the front and the back, like not the ending, but just the front and the back before I dive in, and I look at all the chapters, and I'm a bit ADHD that way, I think, but it helps me get myself grounded. I think I was surprised too to learn that Indigenous kids were in the regular system. Some of them were. I just didn't, I'd never heard that before. I didn't even think it was possible. I found interesting when you talked about how they had talked to the US about setting up residential schools, and that they were advised to not let the church run things, and that they went ahead and did that anyway, despite advice that it would be poorly run and the kids would not be treated well. The chapters on, the treatment, I mean, I think I've read some of that before, but it was really blunt and brutal in your chapters, which is hard to read, but also I think necessary. I loved how, you know, you talked about how it was important to kind of combine the understanding of the two different systems. And I don't know that I've read another book like that where it does really help you learn and reflect on how both are really wrong. Obviously, the Indigenous kids were treated 1,000 times worse, but really kind of hitting home that we're all subjects to Canada. And so it also made me think about years ago, I was watching this panel presentation, and there was a gentleman, Muhammad Yusuf, Yunus, sorry. And he was part of the initiative around microgranting. And he was standing in front of some other middle-aged white men talking about how the education system was basically useless. And we should be teaching kids entirely different things to function in this world, and not to sit, you know, and memorize and repeat rote things for exams. And when he said it, it was very controversial. The whole rest of the panel fought back and you know, had reasons why things should stay the same. So this made me think a bit about that. I also thought about when you wrote about the resistance of the kids and families and communities that, you know, knew and wanted education for their kids, but then also clearly understood how wrong it was and how poorly they were being treated, and, you know, fought back any way they could. That's, you know, extremely courageous. And so that stuck with me. And then I think also the day schools, I knew they were there, but you wrote in there that they closed 10 years later than residential schools. I did not realize that. So that's really recent. I mean, it's all recent, but that's really recent. And I guess my question for you is kind of, I think, how did it impact you while you were writing the book, but actually maybe even more so afterwards, and once it all, you know, everything kind of settled, and you know, how's it impacted you since then?
Good questions. Yeah, thanks so much.
Hello. I'm Shelly. I go by her, sorry. And I'm an autistic individual. I've been struggling with reading lately, but I got to part 3. Even though I've been struggling, I still really did an honest effort. And I was really shocked that, like, the integration of the schools before people started saying, no, you can't do that. And it was like everybody deserves education, and somebody decided, oh no, this is not how it goes. And I really liked all the pictures. I wonder how hard those were to find. My comprehension is not that great when I'm not struggling to read. So I'm just gonna let somebody else go.
Thanks, Shelly.
Great. I think it's over to me. Hi, Sean. I'm Wendy. I use she and her pronouns. I also really appreciated that you took the time to write this book. Really appreciated how, you know, I felt like I was walking through the story. So I felt like there was a lot of sense of who the different people were. You know, you didn't have to write out all the letters that were going back and forth, but you had a really good level of quotes. I felt like I could get a feel for the people involved. Some of the things that really stood out for me, and I would agree with others who've said, like, I haven't looked at anything else that does such a broad view of the education system as a whole. So that was something I really appreciated. But also that idea of structures of indifference really stuck with me, and got me reflecting on, you know, how that plays out for us right now. Definitely there's a lot of challenge in getting white settlers to a place where we can have good conversation, good nuanced conversation. And thinking about, I had heard of Dr. Bryce's work, but really appreciated hearing about Elizabeth Shaw's work, and the things that she wrote about this culture of fear. And just, you gave so many examples like that that really reminded us that resistance was ever present. Like there were people who saw what was going on and saw that it was wrong and spoke up. And then that connects me back to that structure of indifference, where that is always the case. There's always people who see things. And then I was thinking about that as others were speaking just now, and thinking about how, how did that impact the parents of their kids who were non-Indigenous, who were in a non-Indigenous system. And then if they got a glimmer of awareness of the things that Dr. Bryce and others were saying about how bad it was, did that, I guess my question, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are, is, did that structure of indifference kind of play into that? Like, did that kind of fuel that thinking of like, well, it's hard for everyone? Like, I feel like the struggle that all people were having was made clearer in this book than I've seen in some other books. And then it just got me thinking about that, because you also presented all those examples where Indigenous and non-Indigenous kids were going to school together. So there are families that would have known each other, that intersection. They would have had some, I would hope, some humanness to thinking about kids and thinking about what was going on. And so I'm still reflecting on that structure of indifference piece, because I think we still live with a lot of that today. And just took me down some really good roads to think a little more deeply about that, and where are the spaces where we can have conversations without defensiveness, where we can actually explore these issues, because otherwise we're just another version of, not quite enough people are seeing and understanding that we have to take actions to make systems work for us, that our systems aren't just going to inherently do what's right. The systems are going to be contingent on citizens speaking up and speaking up in large numbers. So thank you so much for this book. Really looking forward to hearing more of your thoughts.
One last thing I want to add was that Wendy kind of gave a shout out to some of the books you've referenced. And I had just spent about 8 weeks, kind of like 2-hour sessions with Tyler Shipley's book about settler colonialism. It was such a good, I couldn't believe it. I was like, this is amazing. So I haven't actually read the book. It was gifted to me, but I haven't read it. But watching his 2-hour sessions for like 8 weeks was amazing. So I just wanted to throw that in. I really loved your references as well, just to add to what Wendy was saying. And I'll pass the mic over there to you, Sean.
Yeah, well, first, thanks to all of you for showing up today, but also for engaging with the book. I think I can't remember who was saying it, maybe Kathy or Carol was saying, oh, I saw you were a professor. I was a bit nervous. Academics have a bad reputation for, writing to themselves, often, not considering the way that their work can help and be read by a larger audience. But I tried, to the best of my ability, to kind of please two audiences. As an academic, I have to, write academically. Part of the work that I do is research-based, and is about having a conversation with other historians in the field to help us, generate new knowledge about the past that we can then weave into our teaching and into the popular work that we do. But I think there is also a responsibility, or at least I felt like I had a responsibility. And I talk about this at the beginning of the book. Having a residential school survivor in my family who had asked me to take on part of this work. Part of that ask was not just for my own benefit, to have an academic career, et cetera, et cetera. It was to share what I learned with people, right? To help understand what he went through, but also how that's in relationship to what I went through in a different school system in the same place, and how those different systems overlapped and created very different lives for Patrick and I. And when he asked it to me like that, I started to understand that I had a larger responsibility here. Coming out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report and the work that they've done, to help other settlers understand how these systems worked, how they taught us certain things, how they taught Indigenous people certain things, and how education is actually a core part of the colonial project. We like to think of like, wars and land surveyors and all of these different other pieces of the colonial project. But sometimes we let schools off the hook. We think the schools are about teaching us, which is an inevitably, like an unquestioned positive. Or I hear people say, residential schools and day schools were bad, but they're over. And now Indigenous kids can go to public schools. Everything's great. I often hear that. And so these were sort of the bigger kind of questions that I had kicking around in my head as I was navigating how I would write this book and for who, who would benefit from this book. And, the conventions of the university are such that, I need to write an academic book. It needs to be published with a university press for a whole, sort of reasons. But I felt that responsibility of why am I doing this? I'm doing this to help other people like me, move on from the excuse of I didn't learn this. I never knew anything about this. And so I was sort of writing it for that person, right? I was writing it for me before I came to this knowledge. And I just wanted to, before I respond to everybody's wonderful points and interesting questions, is just say, I'm sure there are parts that were harder than others, but you've all demonstrated, an incredible ability to, it feels really good, I guess is what I'm trying to say, that you can engage and get the big ideas from this book. Because if I had written it above everybody's head, it would be useless to me, right? That's not why I'm doing this work. Yeah.
Sean, just real quick, I wanted to let you know that both Kat and I were having a conversation about how accessible it actually was, as opposed to some of the others. Like Clearing the Plains is a horrific book that everybody should have to read, but it is very academic. One of my favorite books is The Importance of Monogamy, and you did reference that one too. Yeah. But that's a very academic book as well. So Kat and I both had really enjoyed that part of it. And just to add to what you were saying, because I went to the TRC, I went to the testimonies they had in Calgary, and I went to the Edmonton 4-day event. And, they've made it really clear, and of course in the report, the importance of being witnesses, right? And I think this group in particular understands that better than any other, because as far as I know, no one in the country other than us has like legitimately sat down together and read all the volumes of the TRC together, right? Like nobody, no one has done that but us. We've also done the national inquiry, right? So like everyone here really understands that concept of being a witness and then telling that truth to others. And that's why we started the Reconciliation Action Group, because once you have that knowledge, you can't just hold it inside of you, right? Like you and academics, you do that great work all the time and try to spread that truth. But I think like for Canadians, just regular Joe Canadians, we have to do more. And especially there's a few folks that are missing that are teachers as well. And, they talk about how they integrate that into their teaching style. And it's hard because I think you and I know, you always get the one or two teachers that are really great and understand these things and have like an intersectional lens, but like the majority don't yet. And the institutions of these like education boards don't necessarily facilitate each teacher being able to tell the full truth and the whole truth. So I just wanted to add to that to you, just so you had context there too. So now I'll pass it back.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I say this, I think in the introduction, right? But that, one of the core principles of the book and the work that I do is building on the TRC's idea that in order to move towards reconciliation, we first have to have truth. Truth will lead to healing and justice. Healing and justice will then lead us to developing those meaningful relationships. but you know, as Murray Sinclair has said over and over again, he thinks that Canada's rushing the truth part, right? Or rushing reconciliation and leaving the truth behind. And so, you know, I kind of felt, you know, this book came out in 2022. The TRC final report was released in 2015. I finished my PhD in 2016, and I was like trying to write as fast as possible because I felt that there was, again, that responsibility of, I'm not just writing this for my job or to tell other nerdy historians about things. I felt that there was a responsibility to help people like myself, like Patrick, to understand a deeper aspect of the truth. I mean, to be honest, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report, you know, is like the starting place. There's so much more history that needs to be understood here. It's really just trying to bring people up to speed, and add survivor testimony to what we already know. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of start by saying, you know, to me, having a conversation like this in an environment like this is exactly what I hope other academics will do. Because if we're just talking to ourselves, you know, that to me, that's not where the work in this situation needs to be. It needs to be finding ways for all of us to play different roles, right? And you know, I just wanted to say I appreciate you taking the time to engage with us, and you know, I'm happy that for the most part some of the big points came through, and as you said, Michelle, that some of it can be academic, but the big points are accessible. You know, that's a skill that I hope I can continue to build. And as you read other works in the book club, you know, I think there is that responsibility of academics to bridge that gap. If you're only talking to yourselves in an ivory tower, it doesn't make much of a difference in the world. The goal here, right, isn't just to, as you mentioned, to learn the truth for the truth's sake. It's about facilitating the healing and the justice and the reconciliation part. So, yeah, trying to spark those conversations and make it as accessible as possible is very gratifying. So thank you for that. I'll go through some of these observations and questions if that's all right. And if I'm boring you, you can just cut me off or interrupt, please. But I mean, one of the things that I see throughout all of these different comments, and Kathy, you kind of kicked it off by saying that some of the examples are shocking. And, you know, I think they were shocking to me as well as I was doing the research. But I think perhaps the most shocking part is that they were shocking, because they were all sitting there in the archives, in the publicly accessible records that you know, officials were leaving behind. It's not that this truth was hidden or that it was confidential or redacted. It was all just sitting there. And I think that you know, I'm glad, Kathy, that it was kind of opening your mind to some of these things, and that part of the work of historians is to show people the evidence, right? Nobody wants to spend the amount of hours I spend in the archives reading over Department of Indian Affairs records. You know, that's time that I'll never get back, and that most people wouldn't want to do. You know, thousands of hours. But the benefit is that now, because I've done that work, those shocking examples hopefully won't be so shocking. They will be understood by other people, right? That's the work that historians can offer society. Is nobody wants to do that work, but we do, you know. And I think that you know, again, that's that kind of responsibility in the relationship that I hope academics have to society generally, is that we play a role. Just like health professionals, you know, and others, that's something that we can provide. And if truth is the key to reconciliation, we've got more work to do, I guess, is one of the main messages, because this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's there. And I mean, your example, Kathy, of your dad's shock or surprise, I suppose, of having your sister being able to go to a public school. And just a quick point, you know, this book stops in 1930, but by the 1950s, 1960s, after the Second World War, essentially the Department of Indian Affairs comes to the conclusion that it's pretty expensive to have a separate school system. and essentially that, it's money driven, right? They're like, if we can download the responsibility of schooling, right, back onto provinces, we can save a lot of money, essentially. So by the 60s and 70s, you start to see more and more Indigenous children being quote unquote integrated into the public school system. And there's a whole other book that needs to be written on that history and helping people understand, the complicated stories that would have happened at that point. But I'm glad, Kathy, that it opened your mind to thinking about those different things. And Carol, I'm glad, Canmore is not a bad place to go. It's a nice day trip, if I remember that correctly. But I'm glad that it proved useful and that you've taken some notes and offered lots of things. It's offered you lots of things to reflect on. And I mean, maybe just quickly to comment on, again, your sort of shock and surprise about, the level of commitment that many of these officials had, right? We think of Johnny MacDonald. Yes, he's the prime minister, but as I explained, he also chose the position of Superintendent General of Indian Affairs for himself, right? He quarterbacked Western colonization as part of the nation building project. That was a deliberate choice that he made. And he knew what he was doing. We often think it's like good intentions gone wrong, right? And I think part of the work that I was trying to do in those earlier chapters, chapter 2 and chapter, if I remember my own book correctly, 4, is to show that they knew what they were doing from the beginning, right? This was about separating children from their families and communities, to undermine Indigenous lifeways, to facilitate, colonialism and capitalist accumulation and development to support the nation building project. There is not really a gray area. People who say that haven't done the excruciating research to show that this is what people were saying at the time. It wasn't that things, started off fine, but then went wrong. It was like all of those problems were baked into the system from the beginning. It's just that Canada benefited a lot from that system doing its work, and was always supporting the public school system, right? If the idea here that I borrow from this writer, Albert Memmi, wrote a really interesting book called The Colonizer and the Colonized, is that the work of colonization seeks to break down Indigenous people and build up non-Indigenous people. It's like it's two parts. We often only just focus on the colonization and the bad and negative effects for Indigenous people. But colonial officials are always thinking of those two things together, which I hope my book kind of makes sense of for people, is that's the negative and the breaking down of the residential and day school systems were happening at the same time as the building up of the public school system. And I think that is sort of kind of shocking to think about, or it changes the way that we view the separateness of this, and instead understand that these things need to be understood as being interwoven. Yeah, Michelle.
I was just wondering if you had read the book Confessions of a Dead Man. It's not really fiction, but kind of is. It's a story about if you were to have a conversation with Duncan Campbell Scott's ghost.
Wow.
Yeah. And in it, so the guy who wrote it, he found all of these ridiculous quotes that he had said at that time. And it's heartbreaking. It's absolutely heartbreaking. But, the story flows, right? Where he thought he was helping. He thought he was doing good. And so, this is we were helping these Native kids, et cetera, and just horrible, horrible quotes that came out of it. So, it was one of those moments like you, where you're forced to do thousands of hours of research. And he found these quotes and he put it together in a book. And actually, there's a Calgary police officer. I told him about this book and he bought it. And I don't know, I lost mine. So then he bought me my latest copy because, but I said, every Canadian should have to have this book and read some of the ridiculous colonizing belief system that they had at the time, because that's all it was them going through Indian affairs and pulling out these ridiculous quotes. So just to kind of add to what you're saying.
Yeah. And I mean, this is the other thing, is that we often have a view that like so many of the architects of the residential school system are based in Ontario. Their prime ministers are working in the Department of Indian Affairs. They're often in their own world. And one of the things that I found sort of concerning is that if folks remember, one of the people that Johnny MacDonald handpicks is a guy named Israel Wood Powell. And he's the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs in BC. And he's basically taking everything that's going on in Ontario and trying to root it in British Columbia. But I think most people in British Columbia have no idea who Powell is, right? They will have heard of Duncan Campbell Scott. They will have heard of MacDonald. But some of the things that Powell was saying, right? Like, we need to use schools as a soft form of gaining greater control. And then when we have control over their children, right, we will be able to essentially pass our policies in better ways. We will grow our power faster. Powell Street downtown Vancouver, right? I don't think a lot of people have focused on how many people there were that had some of these concerning, openly anti-Indigenous racist beliefs that kind of shocked some of the members of the group, including Carol, and how entrenched these beliefs were, right? And I'll get to the structures of indifference question from Wendy. But yeah, I think part of this was also just showing it's not just a few bad apples, right? That's another thing that we think of when we look at this history. It's just MacDonald, it's just Duncan Campbell Scott. No, it's basically everybody who steps into these positions they get the position because they hold the beliefs and that they'll do the work required. And I think that is a lot more of a devastating realization than there were just a few bad apples. It's actually that the systems that were created that very much benefit Canada are deeply problematic. So Kat, I'm glad that it wasn't too academic-y, and that the idea of education as being sort of a tool of rule, both for Indigenous people, but also for non-Indigenous people, came through clearly. Because I think if we have the ability to have conversations with people about, how public schooling today still, it's better, but it's still at root basically has that same function of training people to build the society that we all live in specific ways. I think we need to have those conversations too. It's not just residential schools are now over, public schools are great. Continue on. Although we need to defend public schools. That's another tangent that we can go to at another point. But what surprised me the most, one of the things that academics get a bad rap for, from particularly the far right, is that we already know the arguments we're going to make, and we just come in and we find the evidence, and then we say what we already understood. And we don't do that. I mean, man, if I already knew what I was going to find, I would save myself 10 years of work. I think what surprised me the most is how deliberate all of it was. I feel like that's a mundane observation, but I feel like the crushing weight of realizing that a lot of these people are just going in, they're checking in 9 to 5, and they're in charge of genocide. Like how sort of matter of fact it is. I think that actually surprised me, how in many ways, we like to think that, as I said, there's these bad apples that are conspiring together in a room. But in reality, these horrible structures were created by people who thought they were doing good, or that they knew what they were doing wasn't good for Indigenous people, but would ultimately be good for Canada and for themselves, that sort of self-interested element. And so I think that maybe surprised me the most, how very quickly people would kind of get sucked up into the system, and then they would maintain that system and the devastation that it would have, even when all of the signs were clearly pointing in a different direction. And I think that that holds a lot of lessons for us today about how atrocities happen under our very noses, and people don't have the ability to push back at them in real time. Maria, I'm glad that you pulled out a lot of pieces that again surprised me. One of them was that we really should think of the Indian residential school system as being modeled on the boarding school system for Indigenous kids in the United States, and that Johnny McDonald sends his friend Nicholas Flood Davin down to the U.S. to speak and consult with officials there, and they say, whatever you do, don't partner with the churches and let them do it, because the money's going to disappear and the kids are going to pay the price. And he reports that, like, what he reports it in his report, and then they're like, yeah, that model sounds really great, and we should let that continue for essentially 100 years before it starts to get phased out in the 60s and 70s, right, where the government is providing for the most part the money, and churches are running the schools with very little oversight. So it just, again, surprising to me that in 1879, before the system gets started, the person who writes the report is saying this is probably not going to be a great idea, and yet I'm still going to recommend it anyway. I think that's pretty damning, and very surprising. And then I guess the focus on resistance. So part of it was that I was coming across all of these examples of quote unquote bad behavior. And that's often how the principals and Department of Indian Affairs officials would talk about, burning down the school, everything from burning down the school to stealing food. It would be, I was coming across these in the context of punishment for bad behavior. And I'm thinking, I think there might be another way to categorize or at least understand what's going on here. And if you dig deeper in these examples, you can see how children as young as like 6 and 7 were figuring out in live time, like, these people don't have my best interests at heart. Mm-hmm. And we need to find a way to get out of here or work together with other people to minimize the damage that was being created, and just the kind of ingenuity of these young kids. I thought deserved to be understood in the context of the devastation that was being wrought. So rather than just focusing on the terrible things that happened, and they did, it was also an acknowledgement of the agency that these children had, and and not just at the end, but like from the beginning. There were people, including students and parents, who clearly understood what was going on and was trying to make change in whatever ways they had available to them. Some more effective than others, sure. But I think it's important that those examples or episodes don't get forgotten as we try to grapple with the full truth of colonial schooling.
Sean, I have to tell you, I so appreciated that you added that throughout, because I actually started laughing, and I read that part to my husband about, the teacher being hogtied and thrown out. I laughed so hard. I'm like, can you imagine, after so much abuse, that you were absolutely able to do that? And for a moment, you felt vindicated for a second. So I really appreciated those moments of resistance that you sprinkled throughout the entire book.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, part of the work that I did, I know, Shelley, you had said you only came across part 3, which is, they're all my favorites, but part 3, I think I was really trying to do something, particularly at the end, where, if you remember, right at the end, I'm talking about essentially a boycott of the Seashell School, and the parents that were trying to convince other Coast Salish communities in Vancouver and on Vancouver Island to engage in a boycott, to essentially change the school's employees and to create better reforms, etc. And I think one of the things that I tried to do is talk about that the resistance to this was ever present, but it was not always successful. Because often what officials would do is they would use the resistance as justification to tighten the screws. And so it was trying to find this balance where we understand the agency of people within these structures, but we also don't glorify, that we can find, like, that burning down or trying to set fire to the residential school was liberatory for many of these students. But it also, because it's happening in a colonial context, it also makes that structure tighten. You know what I mean? And so I think that I was trying to provide this sort of nuanced explanation of how resistance often leads to more resistance, but also more resistance to the resistance, if that makes any sense. And we need to be aware of how, it's not just about coming to the realization. I'll make this connect back to the TRC. I think a lot of people, including myself, had a sort of naive view that people would just read the TRC, and then reconciliation would happen. And I didn't anticipate how much resistance there would be to simple truth telling. I'll get to that in a second with a response to Wendy's question. But I think that trying to understand that kind of complicated relationship between resistance and these structures was something that I wanted to make sure that I included. And just how did it impact me writing it, and how did it impact after? So researching and writing this book was a blessing and a curse. I mean, I think it really helped me feel like I was responding to my family members' ask of trying to learn this, to help people understand it. But it was hard. Like for a good decade, would sit down at the desk every day and be inhabiting a space where I was engaging with people talking about genocide. And it doesn't, some days are better than others. Famously, one of the people who helped on the academic side sort of break the story of residential schools in a bigger way is a guy named John Malloy. I don't know if you've read the book, Michelle, for the book club, but I have it on my shelf here. It's called A National Crime by John Malloy. And he wrote this book coming out of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in the 90s. And it was one of the first sort of major historical works that laid out the national crime. And, he famously talks about, the book sort of derailing his life. He turned to alcohol and other things. It was a difficult thing. So counseling, working with elders, working with community helped me understand and process some of it. But it wasn't, it certainly wasn't an easy task, but it was one that I think was made easier by being very clear about why I was doing it. And I guess maybe the thing that surprised me the most is that, again, sort of to show my own naiveness, is that I thought I would write the book and people would read it and they'd be like, that's interesting, and move on. But what I've actually encountered is a lot of people who essentially are denialists, right? That they are committed to undermining at every stage. They see reconciliation as a threat. They understand the TRC formula of truth, then healing and justice, and then reconciliation. They understand that. So what they do is they try and quibble with the truth so that you don't have to do the healing and justice and reconciliation part. And I mean, boy, I can tell you, I've been publicly attacked. I've had death threats. I've had coordinated efforts to get me fired for simply like reading the Department of Indian Affairs publicly accessible reports and being like, this is crazy, right? And I did not anticipate that. I did not anticipate that level of pushback from a sort of very small but very vocal and well-funded group of individuals. Many of them, unfortunately, who call Alberta home.
Honestly, Sean, I was going to totally interrupt and say, I feel you, because we are here in Calgary. Like, that's who we're up against. So when I see your, whether it's an article in a paper or whichever talking about these denialists, like, they are my neighbors. They are in positions of power. You know, they are the premier, they are the past premier. And like, I know Indigenous people who have literally devoted their entire academic career to debunking Tom Flanagan's work because it's so outrageous. Like, kind of back to what you were saying earlier about how, in particular, as an academic, you can't just pick and choose, but he did, and he got away with it for some reason. So like, I just really appreciate that you do push back, because I know for me, I see it first and foremost, but second of all, I see the coordinated attacks that come because we experience it here. Kind of back to what you were saying about that resistance and naivety. I tell especially the Calgary police how naive I was to think that, you know, we have the 94 calls to action, we have the 231 calls to justice, we have the solutions, let's implement them. Easy peasy, done like dinner. Nope, no. So I just want you to know, like, I have so much solidarity when I see you go through that, because I know that's what I experienced. And my husband had a really hard time at his last job because they were trying to undermine the gravity of what had happened. And I mean, he has been with me for 30 years. So he has met my family. He's met, you know, folks that went to residential school, and he's seen the after effects as well. And so I just wanted you to know, like, the work you're doing is so important. And I know, you know, there's that saying that, you know, first they ignore you, then they, you know, all those things, and then it's just accepted and move on. And I'm just like, I'm waiting for that last part.
Me too. And I mean, you know, I don't mean to make light of it, because, you know, much of it is vicious. But in some ways, I think it shows me that people making these arguments, it's well-intentioned, it's in the past, you know, accounts of abuse are overblown, nobody died. Like, all of these things are just so silly. They're being made by people who know that these are wrong. They're doing it to try and undermine other people's confidence in the truth. And it makes so much more sense to me, because, you know, I've spent all of this accumulated time reading and trying to understand that truth, that when someone says something so silly like that, you know, it did help me to understand what was going on there. And why people are using those kinds of talking points. And, you know, the easy answer is that, you know, they're doing it deliberately, but they're counting on the fact that a lot of people don't want to know the truth. Because, as everybody has said here, you know, reading this or other kind residential school memoirs, whatever you're reading, it is shocking or surprising. And then it asks difficult questions like, huh, so if this wasn't just in the past, but creating a structure that benefits me now, how implicated am I in it? Like, you know, those are some of the deeper, you know, uncomfortable questions that most people would be like, I'd rather not do that. You know, I'd rather not have to engage with, you know, re-envisioning a different kind of relationship, of thinking about my own power and privilege and how that is, you know, taken from, you know, the disadvantage of other people deliberately. Like, the systems are set up that way. And I think that, again, part of why this work is important, not just for me, but for everybody, is that the truth is difficult, right? The truth in this situation, and it's not just that residential schools and day schools were genocidal, which they were, is that public schools also, I think it was maybe Carol was saying, how public schooling helped legitimize all of that, and legitimizes it still today, right? It kind of views this as like, this was a blip or a sad chapter in the past, but we're like good now. I think what I hope that this work can do is, you know, help people understand that it's not, that the very root of many of these institutions are rotten. right? That it's not just that things have gotten bad or that some bad people were in charge, is that schooling for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people has always played a particular role in legitimizing a settler capitalist society that benefits very few people at the expense of a lot of people, and in different ways. And I think that that's a difficult sort of realization, that maybe just slight tweaks here and there are not going to make everything better. And in order to have those difficult conversations with people, we need to know the root of this. And I think that that's what the book was trying to do. Shelley, I spent a lot of time on the photos. It took me almost a year of research. I think in the end, I used 30 photos or 32 photos. I had over like 800 photos, and had to kind of whittle it down to only about 30 to use. But again, because of the commitment to making it accessible, I wanted to find ways for pictures to help augment the arguments that I was making. So finding examples of classrooms like in Souk, for example, on Vancouver Island, where Indigenous kids, were allowed to go to the public school. And then I mean, I can't believe his name was Mr. White, but anyway, Mr. White complains, and doesn't want his kids to be educated with Indigenous people. And, the provincial government makes a change and says if a parent complains, then, they can be barred. But I have photographic evidence of that prior model existing, of Indigenous and non-Indigenous kids going to the same school. So I thought
Sean, just to add to what
photographic,
you're saying, though, how
Yeah.
one parent can change the course of our entire public education system. I have some friends in the queer community, and this one particular bear, he keeps bringing up like 12 parents wrote letters to Scott Moe, the premier of Saskatchewan, to change this conversation about SOGI 123, right? So like it is incredible how the power of this certain demographic, how they can absolutely change the entire public health or the public education system, and it's deplorable. So I just wanted to kind of say that to add to what you're saying, because yes, it's in the past, but this is a present day example of that same concept.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, part of maybe my realization kind of coming out of the book was also, that a parent in this case in Souk, can change the direction of policy, but also how hard Indigenous parents worked to try in very difficult situations to protect their children as much as possible. It just shows that people being invested in this and taking education, as problematic as it might be today, seriously, like that is still, and the public school system we can still understand as being rooted as a settler colonial project, but it's still worth fighting to ensure that our kids have the best experiences possible. Like we can have both things can be true, is what I'm trying to say, and that it is important not to just leave it to the few parents who want to interfere in education for their own particular very narrow self-serving interests. I think it shows that parents have a responsibility to push schools to be the best spaces, even if we understand them as problematic, still the best spaces possible. So it maybe behooves us to take that responsibility seriously. I know, Kathy, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to say that, yeah, it did open my mind on how societies work and how education is used. So I just have to say that I ended up ordering Karl Marx because I'm just like, it's a graphic novel one, but I'm excited for it to come because at least I'll get a little understanding, because social studies was my least favorite subject in school. So I really don't know a lot about how societies and governments work. And basically, I have a question about structures of indifference.
Oh, sure, yeah.
I know you reference Mary Jane McCullum, Logan
Yeah.
McCullum.
Mhm.
Now, does that structures of indifference, is there any other places that that's used? Because I just love, to me, it just kind of like, wow, structures of indifference. It just kind of, it's so expansive. And I'm wondering if there's any other place where it's used.
Well, I mean, thanks for your question, Kathy. And that was sort of getting to Wendy, your comments too about the structures of indifference. So I had some thoughts about that. I mean, just very quickly to answer Kathy's question, it's such a new book. My colleagues, Adele Perry, who's in my department in history, and Mary Jane McCallum, who's at the University of Winnipeg. Their book is fantastic. If you haven't done it for book club, or you have looking for a good read, it's good, it's short, it's accessible, it's devastating. But I think, that sometimes my partner says I like depressing things. I mean, it is sort of my line of work, but I think it's a good book because it shows, I guess, how these structures of settler society are indifferent. That its primary objective is to maintain the structure and the power and the benefit that those structures give certain groups of people. And I think, there's not a lot that has engaged with that book yet. I mean, one of the things about academic work is it takes a long time. I think their book came out in 2019. I'm not sure off the top of my head. But I read it and I thought, this is very similar to what I'm experiencing, right? Wendy noted the Bryce example, the Peter Bryce example of, essentially the Department of Indian Affairs are hearing from a lot of parents that children are dying in higher numbers than should be. The Department of Indian Affairs asks their own medical officer to go and investigate in Western Canada. He writes a report that basically is like, these are bad, right? Just like that Davin guy suggested in 1879, the church's management of these schools means that children are not getting enough food. The sanitation is bad. The ventilation is not good enough, and children are dying at a higher rate than children in that are not incarcerated in residential schools. And the Department of Indian Affairs needs to do differently. And what does the Department of Indian Affairs do with the report? Nothing, right? Because they know, like, they don't care in some ways. That's I think the indifferent part is, if you look at actually that exchange between Duncan Campbell Scott and Bryce and the officials at that time, like, he's saying you need to invest more money in making these schools function better. And Duncan Campbell Scott, ever the penny pincher, was like, no. I'm looking for ways to cut corners. And let's be honest, this is the kind of callous nature of some of these officials, is that the deaths weren't concerning them. They just, didn't want to get bad press. And their project was to disrupt Indigenous communities. So they had a vested interest in not fixing these problems. And I think I noticed that over and over again. And Wendy, you brought up the example, right? Dr. Bryce, and that exchange gets a lot of attention, as it should. But I was finding examples earlier on, at Port Simpson and other schools where, missionaries would go in and they would be like, I cannot believe the conditions of these schools. Like, we need to do something. I need to tell my superior. And the superior would get this letter and they'd ignore it. Like, they're not really interested in the conditions of the school. They're looking at ways to, like, skim off the top, get the money, like, keep this project going, right? They didn't want to rock the boat because the government was paying them. All they were concerned about was getting more money for the schools, not necessarily the care of the children in those institutions. That, is so frustrating to see over and over again. Parents, students, even Department of Indian Affairs officials or missionaries trying to show people the truth, ask those systems to do differently, and the people in charge of those systems being indifferent to human suffering. I think that is an element of these institutions that we really need to take seriously. I see, you're saying it's very similar to other kinds of attitudes today of people, being in charge of these institutions, just sort of, not being courageous enough to figure out ways to change for the betterment of society, but rather operating and maintaining these very devastating institutions. And I think that there's a lesson there about how these institutions work, for what reasons and what purposes, and who benefits most from that. So I think they're coming out of this, Kathy. I think there needs to be larger questions being asked about how structures of indifference worked, yes, in the educational sphere, but also, as Mary Jane and Adele have pointed out, in the healthcare industry, how Indigenous people experience these structures of indifference over and over and over again, not just in the past, but still today in the present too.
Yeah, I also want to say about the tuberculosis sanatoriums. They were money-making operations too. Like Maureen Lux talks about it in her Separate Beds book. Like, that was
Yeah, well,
something else a lot of people don't know.
Yeah, it's hard, right? I mean, because the problem is that the residential school system brings in many different institutions. We're talking about church and state, right? But we're also, I'm doing new research into the Royal Canadian Mounted Police's involvement in residential schooling. And one of the things, I've just published a small article. If anyone's interested, you can email me for it. But basically, the Northwest Mounted Police and then the RCMP essentially were acting as truant officers, right? That if a student ran away, the principal essentially would contact the Indian agent. The Indian agent would connect with the RCMP, and they would go and return the child to the school. But they got paid for that. That was on top of the budget. So they had a vested interest, right, in essentially doing this work. And I've in this article that I passed along, came across a record in the 50s, the 1950s, saying we should stop this because it will save us money. we should find other people to act as truant officers. So the RCMP, were acting in this way and often getting paid to do this work for a long time. And again, it's not that I have a particular axe to grind against the RCMP, but like when you understand that, you start to see the way that the force, why the force exists, the work that they do very differently. And it raises these uncomfortable questions about, if everything from the church and state and RCMP are involved, like it starts to unsettle a lot of myths that Canadians have about Canada, right? That we're the peaceable kingdom, that we're benevolent and tolerant and all of these kinds of things. And you look into it, again, it unsettles a lot of that mythology that, again, to Carol's point, we learned in elementary and high school because it helps us buy into and perpetuate, the way that society operates. So anyway, I see some hands up as well, Shelley and Carol.
I was the system of indifference will just hit me with like ableism, because a lot of people don't know what ableism is.
Mm-hmm.
And they want to keep the status quo of a lot of, I want to say, white male people that are disabled. And when it comes to other people of color and women, it's just kept perpetuating. Like a lot of people that were killed in the States by police were people that had disabilities. It just kind of got me thinking.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. One of the examples is that often when confronted with accessibility, many institutions will say, "Oh, I never thought of that before." And then the follow-up is like, "Okay, well, now that you thought about it, you're going to change it, right?" And it's like, well, it's kind of expensive, like, and so you start to see how, even if people understand an issue, if it means that they have to change or do something different, often their response will be indifference, because they benefit. Like if I got, if I'm in charge of a building and it's going to charge me, this much to make it accessible to someone who isn't me, right? You can see how people who, like just make those problematic decisions, right? And it kind of like enforces itself. And so I think we see that to Kathy's point, we see those structures of indifference operating in all sorts of places. So this isn't like a residential school specific thing. It was just that I noticed that formulation or explanation of structures not really caring because changing wouldn't benefit that structure. I think we can see that applied in a variety of other examples. So thanks for your question there. Carol.
So my comment to you is, and I was thinking about early in the book, you say history won't stay in the past. And this history can't stay in the past. It mustn't. And so we need illuminators. You are in my opinion, an illuminator. You take our stories and you clean them up. And so I have a lot of gratitude for people like that who do things like that. But I can also feel fear about history, some of the history that is coming forward, and not specifically about Indigenous people, but I mean, I think I'm saying I fear some of the history that's going to repeat itself. So that phrase spoke to me on many levels, and I didn't know if it did you as well. So I was a bit curious about that.
Yeah, no, thanks for your question. I mean, one of the reasons I chose to call the book Lessons is it kind of keys into this idea of like learning from the past so that we don't make the same mistakes. That was one of the many reasons, kind of thinking about hopefully, readers would learn from the book and then be able to be better equipped, as Michelle said at the beginning, to be part of the work of ensuring that things don't happen like this again, or being involved in, transforming public education in the context of teachers. I was thinking of teachers as an audience. I know that a lot of my colleagues at the University of British Columbia use the book or parts of the book in their teacher training, which I'm of course very happy, to have educators understand those structures better. But I mean, I think here's the problem. Reconciliation, meaningful reconciliation, is going to require a deep, not only rethink, but also react. A different way of establishing relationships with Indigenous people. It is not surface level. If you look at the calls to action, for example, they are, some of them are kind of more superficial or more symbolic, and a lot of those have been done or are in the process of being completed. But a lot of the chunky stuff, changing child welfare, changing the justice system, changing like some of these really big, hard things, it requires not just like one good government or a priority for a couple of years. Marie Sinclair always says that this is going to be a multi-generational project. Residential schools did damage over many generations. Fixing it will take many different generations. But the key to ensuring that we do not lose the momentum, right? Like we've had this before, as a historian, I can tell you, it's like there's a pattern, right? You call a royal commission, you have that commission, the commission tells you what not to do, you get it, it gets headlines for a little while, and then you put it on the shelf and it gathers dust, and then you do it over again, right? Because by the time the report is out, it's probably going to be someone else in charge of government, and it just kind of gets lost in this kind of colonial cul-de-sac of knowing the answer, of having the blueprint to do differently, and then choosing not to do that. Like most of the TRC, and this isn't a slag against it, but many of the things that shocked Canadians in 2015 about the TRC, we knew from the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1996. Many of the core recommendations are very similar. So my hope, the key that I hope we get from this moment is that we don't do that. We don't just kind of move on, but there will be people in this reading group, in courses that I teach, in seminars that I give, that people will learn some of this and they will implement those lessons of trying to ensure that things do change so that we have a better shot at implementing those calls to action, even if it takes us longer than we would want to. I mean, I think, you know, I have colleagues who kind of track Canada's progress on the calls to action. And I think there has been sort of a lot of people have said, oh, we're not moving fast enough, and perhaps we're not. I always remember Murray Sinclair. Every time he speaks, I try and listen to what he's saying. And he said, you know, I'm actually surprised that we got this many done already. You know, he's like, you know, like kind of more of an optimist, right? That if we can commit to the truth part, then that truth part will serve us well as we continue to push to make progress on these things. And so I think, you know, it would be easy to write a book like this and think of myself as a pessimist, but I'm not, actually. I'm an optimist. I do believe that despite all the weird things that get sent to me by people who don't want to listen, I think there are way more people who want to learn this, to commit to doing differently, to build different relationships. And, you know, I see that, to be honest, I see that in my students. You know, I'm now getting to the point of my career where, you know, I used to think, oh, you know, we're in the same generation. And now I'm realizing that we are very much not. But I have hope because, you know, I see for many of them, they come into my class with a level of knowledge it took me a decade to learn, because, you know, they're learning in different ways. Like, I'll just share one example, and kick me off whenever you want here, Michelle. People got other things to do with their evenings, but one of the heartening examples I have of this, where, to Carol's point, I feel hopeful that people are learning this and that we are making more change than we think, is my neighbor's an elementary school librarian, and she invited me to her school to read for I Love to Read Month. And so I chose a story, a part of a story from a book called Fatty Legs, which is about girl's experience in residential school in the North. And I get to the class, I'm not sure what to expect. It's a 5-6 split. And so, you know, I'm getting ready and I'm like, okay, you know, just to start off, like, what do you know about residential schools? I'm going to be reading from this book. And I'm expecting, you know, a 5-6 group. You know, like for me, you know, I was too afraid to wear jeans in grade 6 because I couldn't figure out the button. You know, so I'm thinking, you know, they probably don't know a lot here, right? And this kid puts up his hand at the back and he's like, well, you know, residential schools were like the church and the government working together to take, you know, Indigenous children away from them to support, you know, the building of Canada. And now we have Orange Shirt Day and we learn about the truth of survivors so that it doesn't happen again. And I'm like, you know, it took me that totally caught me by surprise, right? And, you know, and then all the other, you know, students put up their hand and added different things. Oh, well, you know, a survivor came to talk to us, you know, last month about X, Y, or Z. And I'm thinking, you know what? Like, here we are, like, oh, we're not moving fast enough. Oh, things aren't going to change. I'm like, these kids got it. Like, these kids have a level of awareness about this and a commitment to try and make things better that it's taken people like me a long time to figure out. And that gives me a lot of hope. Are they going to sit down and read my book? Probably not. But that's not the way that this is going to work. It's like all of these different truths, finding ways, whether it be in the elementary or high school classroom, whether it's in university, whether it's in a book club like this, whether it's in your church group or your community group or at the public library. I think people's desire to learn this and figure out different ways to relate to one another, I do see a lot of change in that regard. And it makes me hopeful that we are going to learn those lessons. But it's not a given. It requires that effort. It requires you showing up on a Monday night in January to talk about an academic book. that most people wouldn't want to do, when Netflix is right there. But that level of action, I think, is really important. And the benefits that we as a society can have from people who are actively engaged in understanding the truth and in their small way trying to figure out ways to act differently and better. I think that that's one of the key things. I hear people all the time say, I've read the 94 calls to action, but I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to do. Like a lot of them are saying the government will do this, the government will do that. But I think what ordinary Canadians can do is figure out ways that they can understand the truth and talk to people about it in their lives. And that ripple effect will be ginormous. And the long-term effect, maybe I'm biased as a historian to think of, change doesn't happen overnight. It is incremental. And I think that even just the existence of a book club like this, 5-10 years ago, I don't think would have necessarily, it would have had the same uptake. So I guess that's me trying to end on a hopeful and positive note, is that we all don't need to do the same thing. Here, I just wanted to read a part of from, this is a knock on the door. Well, you can't see that there. So a knock on the door. This is the a sort of summary of the TRC report, but you've read them all, so you're ahead of most people. Okay, this is on page 144. The commission says, although the commission has been a catalyst for deepening our national awareness of the meaning and potential of reconciliation, it will take many heads, hands, and hearts working together at all levels of society to maintain momentum in the years ahead. And I think that my long-winded answer to you, Carol, is that I think there are more people invested today in keeping that momentum going than we sometimes realize. And that this is sort of what it looks like. This small, what seems like a small act of reading a book, of talking to people, of sharing, some things that you learned with others, like that's kind of what it is, like replicated over and over again. So thanks for being here and for taking the time to read the book and asking questions. So thank you.
I probably should just interject too, because January 4th just came up. And I think like the spirit of reconciliation is obviously well beyond the 94 calls to action, right? And January 4th was Ribbon Skirt Day. And that wasn't something that was written about because it happened recently, where a young girl was shamed at her school for wearing a ribbon skirt on a formal day by a teacher who was obviously an ignorant ass. And as a result, January 4th is my birthday. Everyone hates my birthday for the simple fact that that's usually the Monday back from holidays, right? So no one likes my birthday. So that was the day we all chose to protest it, because it happened as like a Christmas concert. And so, we all had our holiday. And then on January 4th of that year, we were all like, screw you all. We're all wearing our ribbon skirts. This was like a protest we all did. And again, back to the idea of reconciliation and the spirit of reconciliation, the government was like, yeah, let's make this real. And they made that real, so that, it's not a paid day off, but it's National Ribbon Skirt Day, to acknowledge that day and to acknowledge this young girl who was wrongly shamed in her school system for wearing a ribbon skirt for her Christmas concert. So like, I think too, because Sean, obviously your colleagues are probably all at the Yellowhead Institute. And when they came out with their report saying, 0 calls to action were done this year, like that's very devastating for me to read. Like I was very sad about that. So when but then when Ribbon Skirt Day happened, it was like, but that's an example of reconciliation and the spirit of reconciliation that's bigger than just beyond the 94 calls to action. So, and what you said was so brilliant. I hope that people who watch podcast or the YouTube or whichever can always remember that, that can be done anywhere. Had my husband's old work just instead decided to not be assholes about, Indian residential schools, maybe he'd still be there. Maybe he wouldn't be, anyway, it doesn't matter. It's that bigger picture that people can do more and should do more. And I should say to you all, one of the community associations outside the 12 that I used to represent had me come speak, and they sent a message that they had read Unsettled, and that really taught them to be humble, right? So like these books matter, and the more we recommend them to everybody else, I think the better. And in this case, this Lessons in Legitimacy, it's so interesting to me, because one of the things that I've always thought about, Sean, is and I'll give you an example. Prior to the TRC here in Calgary, we hosted this national poli-sci student conference that they have. And I was brought in on a Sunday afternoon. Most of the folks had already gone home. And I did the land acknowledgement. And it was the first time they had heard it. Because as you know, Calgary was like the last place in Canada to want to do land acknowledgements. And so I opened up by starting that, and all of the BC poli-sci students were like, finally, we get to hear a land acknowledgement, because in BC it was so normalized long before the TRC. So it's just shocking to me reading this about state schooling in BC, and BC already being so much more aware of Indigenous issues and understanding Indigenous issues in such a different way than the rest of the country. Am I wrong there? Do you see that too? Or what are your thoughts about how others see Indigenous inclusion across the country?
Yeah, I mean, I have an interesting perspective, because I grew up, I was born and raised in North Vancouver, in British Columbia, and that is where my roots are, where I understand myself to be. But the process of becoming a professor has taken me across the world. I've moved to Ontario for university. I've moved to London in the UK. I've lived in Calgary. I now call Winnipeg home. And so I've been able to see my own home, British Columbia, differently as a result. And I mean, I would say that BC in some ways is ahead on many issues. But at the same time, one of the things that is perhaps uncomfortable about British Columbia is much of it continues to be unceded, stolen Indigenous land. So yeah, sure, there are some municipalities and groups that have been doing really good work on raising awareness about land acknowledgements and trying to develop better relationships. But they're doing so in a context where the land has simply been stolen, and there's no treaty. There's no real, so there's like a symbolic work being done that is good and is helpful. But it operates in a very different context. I mean, one of the maybe more surprising, I guess, findings of the book is how the public school system was funded. I don't know if anyone picked that up, but essentially it was that stolen land generated the money for the school system continually, not just a one-time thing, but essentially they stole land, and then they gave municipalities certain lots that they sold, and then used the money to fund the school and keep it going. And how interesting is that how schooling and land is connected, and the funding of that did actually kind of took me a while to really understand and put those pieces together. I mean, school funding sounds pretty boring. And I spent a lot of time digging through these documents to figure out they're really just saying you can have this land and we're going to take over the 99% of it. And then we'll give some of it to the school board to sell off, and then they're going to save that money. Same with residential schools. This is what a lot of people don't understand, is that here in treated areas, we do, I think there are some that think, well, BC doesn't have any treaties, but we have treaties. Well, our treaties are not particularly great, and we're not really upholding many of those promises. And the treaty process was also one of dispossession. And it was you have these reserves, we're going to take over all the rest of the money, we're going to parcel it up, we're going to sell it, the money that we get from selling it, we're going to put into a fund that's going to accrue a whole bunch of interest. And then we're going to use that interest to pay for residential schools, day schools, all of the different things. That's why, taxpayer money, people say, oh, Indigenous people use all of this taxpayer money. They don't know about, the Indian fund, which was basically just like the cream of, the interest of stolen land that was sold and then used to maintain the colonial project. I don't know where I'm going with this because I've been talking for a while, but I think that's unsettling, right? To see how, regardless of perhaps the differences in Canada, of, maybe how far ahead some places are as opposed to others, the structures of how settler capitalism works is working and is pretty strong everywhere, because that was how it was intended. These structures were built for that purpose, and they continue to serve that function. And that's, I think, the hard part is, will reconciliation be more of a symbolic, we recognize some wrongs and we want to bring you into this structure that benefits us? Or are we courageous enough to challenge that structure and think about different ways of relating and living together? And that takes us outside of my expertise. But I think that understanding the root of these systems begs those difficult kinds of questions. And, I think that's where that work will need to go in future, of thinking about how do we move forward in ways that actually shakes up these systems rather than, just brings more people into them.
Well, really important conversation considering the immigration conversations that are happening nationally as well. Thank you, Sean, for coming and spending your time, your evening with us on a cold winter Monday evening, just so that we could talk to you, because I especially the members of the Reconciliation Action Group here that do that work, I think that they need to hear from, a little outside our bubble about moving forward and being patient and working within these systems, and seeing that the very structures that were created in the 1800s are exactly the same structures that we're fighting today with that, settler anxiety and how that's repeating, and they are not learning those lessons, etc. So I just can't thank you enough from the bottom of my heart.
No, thank you, and thanks to all of you for spending some time over the holidays or in the early new year of engaging with the book in whatever way you were able. Really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you folks, and take I take inspiration from you as well. Doing this work of convening people, of getting together as a group and collectively working on these issues. It's the model. It's kind of how change happens. So thanks so much, and really look forward to hearing more about the group. And it looks like you have a phenomenal 2024 lineup already. So good luck and enjoy. Hopefully you don't have to go all the way out to Canmore to get the rest of the books, Carol.
I can't thank you enough. This will probably go up on Sunday or Monday, so that'll be on our podcast and on the YouTube as well, so we can send it to a few of our members who aren't able to come today, but we'll get to meet you and get to hear what you had to say and such. So I so appreciate you taking the time and going through all of this with us. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, everybody.
Okay. Thanks, everybody, for coming today, as always. And I look forward to seeing you at the next one. Don't hesitate to reach out to any of your friends and family, encourage them to come, and maybe share an old YouTube or podcast that had one of our past book clubs from maybe last year that you really enjoyed, so that you can, show your friends and family that this is why you're always busy and always have your nose in a book. And I recently came across a Black librarian in the States that was being bullied by some, I don't know, influencer. I don't even know who the influencer is. I just blocked him. But that bigger picture, that he was such a sweet person that brought all of this joy. So this is somebody new I'm following on TikTok, and I absolutely want to encourage that. And I did send you an email asking about your RCMP report there, Sean. And Sean says here, you can always send me an email too. Happy to answer any questions, because obviously everyone here is coming in good faith, as opposed to all of those nasty trolls that he must get on a regular basis. So, oh, and I also encourage everyone here to write a positive review for Sean to, again, offset the negative ones and hopefully encourage others. And Carol, of course, saying thanks for being an illuminator again, which is a great point, Carol. I'm so grateful each and every one of you contribute the way you do. Thank you, folks, for coming today.